on questions about international economic law since 1995, when I first started teaching international trade and investment law in the very beginning of the World Trade Organization. So I've been thinking about these questions for a long time, but I think for many people, the interrelated crises of the early 21st century, so food, fuel, finance, financial, climate, and refugee crises, all made it seem more urgent to revisit the question of how it is that the global economic order came to take the form it has today, and what role international law had played in establishing and regulating this international economic order. And the questions seem to be vital because although we are part of an interdependent global economy, nonetheless these crises weren't experienced by everyone. So somehow they were experienced in a systematically uneven way. So despite the system of free trade and investment flows and openness of the economy, somehow vulnerability, economic vulnerability, was geopolitically ordered and spatially arranged. So not everyone was vulnerable. So how could it be that in a global economic system, risk and vulnerability somehow weren't distributed evenly? So many people have turned to this question of how we should understand the nature of this economic order and what is it in the routine operation of the global economy and of international law that somehow produces a situation in which we see states being required or deciding to continue exporting vital resources even during periods of scarcity, or how it is that investments can be protected even in the face of situations where environmental or health or peace and justice questions, for instance, might seem to pose the need to reconsider investment priorities. Or how could it be that people who labour to produce essential commodities somehow end up still impoverished or undernourished or even dispossessed, often in ways that resemble the old structure of colonial vulnerability. So why would it be that so many people who were experiencing food insecurity were located in countries that had formerly been colonies? Nothing in the standard ideas about decolonisation would explain why vulnerability continues to be organised in this uneven way. So I did find that in many ways the traditional approaches to studying or teaching or practicing international law often made it harder rather than easier to grasp the role of international law in global economic ordering. And there were four ways in particular in which this seemed to be the case. The first was that international law is largely a project of liberalism. So it's a liberal project in which, since the late 19th century, international lawyers have worked with politicians, but often with political economists and economists, to work towards liberalisation. And international law, like liberalism, is therefore a way of thinking about the world that focuses on freedom. But liberalism and international law doesn't pay as much attention to the coercion that underpins freedom. So we're comfortable thinking about freedom and much less comfortable thinking about international law as itself a system of compulsion and coercion. So the first issue then is the tendency of liberal forms of thought to understand themselves as being about freedom, freedom of labour, free markets, free contracts, but not about the ways in which structural or other forms of relations create compulsions to enter into labour agreements, to enter into contracts, to enter into structural adjustment programs, and the many other ways in which free choices are themselves the products of coercion. So that would be the first problem. The second is one that we're used to thinking about as fragmentation. So international lawyers tend these days to specialise in one area of law. International human rights law, international investment law, international law and the use of force, international criminal law. And it's much less common, in fact it's very difficult to think about all those fields together. But this means that if we want to think about the ways in which international investment law might be historically linked with the law relating to when a state can intervene or when the collective security system might intervene in another country, or if we want to think about the ways in which trade liberalisation is accompanied by migration, dispossession and refugee crises, we tend not to be able to think of these things together because we study them in separate courses. And similarly, when people write histories of international law, mainstream histories tend to focus on the United Nations or histories of war and peace. You don't often get a mainstream history of international law that talks about the negotiation of the GATT. So we get specialised histories of international trade law or specialised histories of international investment law, which are wonderful, but we have far fewer studies that try to understand how did the emergence of an investment regime sit alongside the emergence of an intervention regime, alongside the emergence of regimes that govern the movement of people. The third difficulty is that international lawyers tend to understand themselves as being concerned with the relations between states. And so historically, if we were asked to explain what international law was, we'd say it's the law that governs the relations between sovereigns. And in theory, international law isn't concerned with what happens within the state. But of course, we know that much of international law today focuses exactly on how states themselves can conduct government administration. We could think of international human rights law, we could think again of international investment law. So these forms of law shape what the state can do and how it can do those things. And we tend to think of this now in the language of policy space or regulatory choice. So thinking about international law as something that shapes what happens within states is the next way in which rethinking international law has to take place. And if we think, again, historically, we can see that in fact, for instance, free trade debates have always been as much about what the state can do internally as what it can do externally. Finally, I think that standard ways of thinking about international law make it harder to see the forms of law that shape economic order because international law is about embedding political choices and politically volatile concepts within routine. So, for instance, we might see that states negotiate a treaty, an investment treaty, that makes quite politically controversial choices about what states can do, and lawyers then transmit that legal material from hand to hand in classrooms, in decisions, in articles, so that over time we teach students and we teach ourselves to forget about the politics involved in determining the meaning of expropriation or thinking about the meaning of collective self-defense. So we, through the process of routine, through the process of transmission, we make political material less volatile. And in many ways that's a good thing because we want international law to make politics more straightforward. So one of the reasons we look to law rather than invading another country is because it routinizes politics. It makes it seem less volatile, so things proceed more smoothly. But if we want to remember the political choices that are embedded in the law, then this capacity of the law to routinize or to depoliticize can be very disabling for analysis. So for all of those reasons, it seemed necessary to think in new ways about how international law has participated in shaping economic order. So I'm coming to the very end of a large book project that tries to take on the challenges I've just suggested. And the basic argument is that international law has played a role in shaping the emergence of global economic order in part through determining who and what the state can represent. So rather than thinking of international law as something that only shapes relations between states, this project tries to look historically at the ways in which liberal economic ordering proceeding through international law has sought to constitute economic order, both through freedom but also through coercion. So it looks at areas of law that we think about largely in terms of freedom and protecting liberty. These would be areas like free trade and investment protection. And we can see these regimes emerge across the 20th century. But at the same time, while those regimes are concerned with liberalisation and with freedom, they also depend upon ways of policing resistance, ways of responding to dispossession, and ways of controlling people and the relation of people to land. And these forms of law we can see emerging through freedom of movement, so regimes that enable the right kinds of movement across seas and oceans. We can see this through the law relating to collective security, which allows powerful states to determine what it is to threaten the peace and to work in concert in ways that collectively stabilise situations that are seen to be destabilising to the system. And we see it also through regimes that govern rights, including the rights of corporations. So the ambition of the project overall is to look at the ways these different regimes work together to constitute global economic order, and to bring again to the foreground the material limits to liberalisation, those limits being human beings and land. So that while there are fantasies that we can just liberalise economies, still something has to be done about the people and the land that are the subject of the material grounds of this economic project. And I think that at the moment we're seeing re-emerging not only these crises that I've been talking about, but also political challenges to these projects of remaking of the state through challenging investment arbitration, and I think this is a question that's very live in Colombia at the moment, through challenging trade liberalisation. And so we're seeing a moment where these questions about what the state can represent are back on the table. And I think although that is a result of crisis, it's also an opportunity. And I think it's an opportunity that many of us now are going to be working towards trying to grasp and see if we can rethink the question of what the state can represent and the role of international law in making that possible.